All right, we're recording. This is another episode of what I'm still calling Things That First Year Writers Need to Hear until I come up with a more snappy title. I'm here today with Professor Margaret Thickstun of Hamilton College. I believe what are you, the Jane Watson Irwin Professor of Literature, which you would never say out loud, but which I will.
Irwin.
Irwin, right.
Right. Yep.
And you and I've worked with you and under you in various positions. You were my advisor on the Emerson Grant project that I did when I was at Hamilton, where I spent a summer and sort of developed and then taught a 2-week writing clinic for students that are about to go off to college. I took your Milton class, which is still one of my favorite classes, and I'm so sad that I only took it in my final semester. But at the same time, I'm glad because it made the final semester very fun. And I've also worked under you as a sort of writing tutor / kind of sort of co-teacher, if I'm being generous with myself, for Hamilton's Higher Education Opportunity Program, HEOP, which essentially takes a bunch of students from, not as privileged backgrounds that could probably succeed at Hamilton if they had the background education, and over the course of 5 weeks, just boot camp drills it into them. And you taught the writing course that they all had to take, and then I was a writing tutor under that. So this is all to say that we're fairly familiar with each other in some professional sense. And the other thing that I wanted to mention here at the start is that I have like a list of 6 or 7 various professors and teachers in my head that I've just sort of observed over the years that, I try to model my own pedagogy after in some extent, and you're on the list. And it has, well, yeah, fine, it's flattery, but, I'm saying it because it's true, not because it's... But the thing that was very interesting, and maybe this is something to talk about as well, but the thing that was very interesting to me was that the moment we walked into your class, you told us, call you Margie. And you were exactly that kind of like level of friendliness that didn't devolve into, like, it was a familiarity that didn't breed contempt in some sense, and I've seen that's like the perennial problem for a lot of teachers, is how you get to that point without sacrificing the respect of the students. And it seemed to me that at least I still respect you, or at least I try to show it. So that's kind of another one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to you specifically. But like I was saying before we started, I've got a few different questions that I want to run by you and see what you think. But I think I will start with the most unhelpfully broad question I can ask, which is, hypothetically speaking, if you had an hour to talk to students about all the things that you'd like to talk to them about when they were taking their first year writing course, but didn't have time to talk to them about, what would you tell them?
So it seems to me that most of the students that I get at Hamilton have pretty good training from high school about organization. The teachers have gotten that sense of needing to have structure, but they don't have a clear idea about writing as communication. So who's the audience? There is actually a person at the other side of this piece of paper, and you're trying to explain something to that person. And part of that problem arises because you're always writing for the teacher, and the teacher knows everything. So it's really hard to figure out what you might need to tell the teacher. And then that turns into instead a kind of performing for the teacher, using big words, using complicated sentences, and those things get rewarded in high school. And I understand why that happens. If I had the teaching load that a high school teacher has, when I got to a student who clearly liked language and knew how to use a sentence, I would just say great and go on to the next paper. So one of the nice things about college, and the frustrating thing for students about college, is that I have a much lighter student load, and so I can really push at the writing of every student in front of me. So I talk when I'm talking about literature about this idea of authorial audience that Peter Obinitz developed, where anyone writing has to be writing to someone and has to therefore think about what that person will know. So if you're writing a detective story, you're assuming that your reader has read some detective stories, has assumptions about the genre, and will be looking for clues and red herrings. And if you're setting it in the present, you'll assume that there's all kinds of social knowledge that you can just draw on without having to explain. But if you set it in an historical period, you're going to have to do more discussing and orienting. So if you then take that concept to your own writing, you have an audience. Who is your audience? I try to have students imagine the audience being the other students in the classroom, because that gives a general sense of the age and the social experience, and then also the technical experience from the classroom. So if we've all read a particular book and we've all talked about it, we've all been involved in the conversations, then there are lots of things that you can just gesture toward without having to spell out. And then there are things that you need to explain. And if you're explaining to another person who is like you and just newly encountering a text, it's easier to figure out what that person might need to know, because you're sort of thinking about what did you need to know. So that seems to me the biggest conceptual leap from high school to college is thinking about, this is real. I'm really explaining to someone what I really think about something, or how I understand something and how they can understand it too.
Yes. As far as I can tell with my much more limited experience, yes. Because the one thing I tell my students is that you're writing for me. I am a real person. Hi, I'm Thane Riopel. And if we're in person, I'll when they're in office house, I'll get hi, shake their hand. I'm your, talk to me.
Yeah.
And then they still don't, because the moment they can hear that and it makes sense, then they sit down, they snap right back into their old ways of doing it. So it's something you have to actually practice. But it seems to me that happens as well with reading, where you get this, like we read something by Foucault this semester, which was,
You poor thing.
well, I read it for my class, and I had my students read it partly under duress, for, under duress on me for the class I was teaching. And so I'm going to say this more for the benefit of people listening, but here's my thought on Foucault. When I was reading Foucault in my graduate level class this semester, one of my classmates said, every time I read Foucault, it makes me doubt my own reading comprehension skills. And I said, every time I read Foucault, it makes me doubt Foucault's writing skills. And I think that's probably the two attitudes you can take to it. And that's all I'm going to say at the moment. But suffice it to say, it's a very difficult piece, and it's a thing that you read and it looks like it doesn't sound like there's a person on the other side of the writing. It sounds like it's this natural object that you're supposed to interpret in some sense and not actually listen to the person, convoluted though the speech may be, to hear what they're saying. And it's, maybe it's something like if when they're writing, students are performing instead of communicating, then when they're reading, maybe they are observing it as a sort of artistic performance that they are supposed to interpret in some sense, as opposed to a piece of communication that they're supposed to hear. That would be sort of a hypothesis. I don't know. And maybe this is a segue into the question I wanted to ask you about reading, but what are your thoughts on that in general?
Well, before we go to the reading part, I was going to say that one of the ways to break through is to share your writing with people other than the person who's going to be assessing it. So, a writing tutor, a roommate, a family member who is not super informed about your topic. Um,
Mm.
but so someone who can ask questions, and then when I do tutorials with groups of students reading each other's work, in the instructions that I give are, as you were saying, if you don't understand something, you want to mark, mark that you didn't understand it, and then ask the person to explain it more clearly. I mean, that we often assume that the problem with reading comprehension is in us as readers,
Hmm.
when it may in fact be in the writer's it might be that the thing is really complicated, and you need to think harder about it, but the writer can also make it more clear.
Right.
And if you have a real person asking you questions about things, then you start by actually talking it out, and once you've talked it out in relation to a real person, then you can get it onto paper in a clearer form. So yeah, just, there is writing that is really difficult, and there are places where the writing being really difficult is perceived as a virtue, but in most writing, it's not, and you should be in control of whether you're trying to do that kind of writing or whether you're trying to communicate with people.
Well, this is one of the things I found is that this isn't a hard and fast rule, but a lot of the most profound books that I've read have been short.
Mhm.
I still think that C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity is some of the most impressive writing on a clarity level
Mhm.
that I've ever read.
Mhm.
I mean, whatever the listeners may think about the actual theology behind it, it's if you should read at least a part of it just to hear how he talks about extraordinarily complex ideas. He's talking about like the existential question,
Mhm.
and he does it in a way that that basically anyone can follow, and it's
Mhm.
amazing.
Mhm.
And that's good writing, as opposed to what's well is it, I believe it's or former professor uh, Al Kelly's statement that 90% of books should be articles and 90% of articles shouldn't exist.
Right. Yes. Yes. Well, the other thing you're just getting into there is too, that there's a difference between um, academic writing, writing to communicate, and creative writing. And so
Mm,
so a lot of my students who like writing are creative writers. They would like to write, just describe scenes. They would like to write poems, and the kind of nuance and ambiguity and multivalence that's perfectly appropriate in a poem is not appropriate when you're trying to explain mitosis.
right.
Just, so it's a matter of also thinking about writing context. So a lot of my colleagues will give assignments that are, you're writing a letter to the editor, you are writing an abstract to a scientific journal, ones where the and you would never sit down to write a lab report without thinking about what a lab report is. But people sit down to write papers for their English classes, I think, without really thinking.
Yeah. Um, that's See, this is why I was having so much trouble coming up with good questions to ask. Because like every single thing, I want to go off on like five different tangents. But I will, as the facilitator, I will be somewhat disciplined here. Um, One of the reasons, as I was saying before we started, that I wanted to have you on was because not in addition to teaching several different writing intensive courses and writing courses around different, like in the summer, in the school year, um, you also teach a first year reading course. And that's one that I haven't taken.
Well, it's not exactly a reading course.
Mm,
It's a course about reading, and so I call it the experience of reading. It's a course about thinking about readers and thinking about yourself as a reader.
oh,
So
okay.
it's
That's exactly
it's
what I meant, even if I
okay.
probably said it badly. But
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
very interested to hear what you
yeah.
think about that and how it may tie into some of the things we're saying about writing and reading and, leave the arithmetic to the math department. But, you know,
Uh, yeah. So, in all of my classes, of course, what you focus on is some kind of close reading, slowing down, paying attention to exactly how things are being said. I probably do that more in the study of poetry class than in um, the classes that work on narrative. But so in that course, each book has as its main character a a person who is a big reader, and some of the books are fiction. Northanger Abbey, where she gets all excited about the Gothic novel and then thinks she's in the middle of one and then gets in all kinds of trouble because she thinks life works like a Gothic novel, or The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, where he's writing a detective story and he wants to solve the crime, and and that gets him into trouble. But also books like Ben Franklin's autobiography and Frederick Douglass's narrative, where they're real people and they talk about how I learned to read, what I was able to read, and that's really that's what I'm interested in. What were people reading? What did they think they were doing as a reader? What was the purpose of reading? And Ben Franklin has these lists of the things that he read as a child, and almost none of them we would consider pleasure reading or appropriate for children. I mean, The Pilgrim's Progress is about the most lively book that he read as a child. And then when it gets to things like Richardson's Pamela, he talks about how exciting it is. And I'm thinking like, oh, imagine a world where The Pilgrim's Progress and Pamela were like the most wild and crazy reading opportunities.
Maybe that explains a lot about Ben Franklin, or asks more questions. I'm not sure which, but
So yeah, and one of the things that I think about in that class, and I think about in all of my introductory core classes. So I've said to you, I'm because of writing across the curriculum, I was told by the powers that be that I should not be teaching a standalone writing class that's antithetical to the ideals of writing across the curriculum, which I agree with. So I said, oh, okay, but still, if you want to focus, if I want people focusing on writing, on how to write about things, about on communicating with someone else, then the texts that I work on need to be fairly accessible, so that we're not spending all of our time trying to figure out how an entail works and what the social mores are of a Jane Austen novel. But we've got the plot, we've got the characters, and then we can talk about the mechanics and how does the writer create point of view, and then how do I pull out evidence, those sorts of things.
right.
Yeah.
So it's the ever-present struggle between making sure your students understand the content,
Right.
so that you can then move on to discussing the form and
Right.
the techniques, or whatever you want to call it.
Right. Well, and as you say, and making space to actually talk about their writing. And it's really hard. I find the way that I make space is that I just have days on the syllabus that say, we're going to talk about writing. And then since I have it there, I have to do it, because otherwise the talking about the text would just
Hmm.
expand to fill up the space.
See, I'm the other way around. I have to make space to actually talk about the text, because I would much rather, like, you can tell probably by the fact that I've started a podcast about it. I would love to nothing more than to sit around with my students and just talk with them about how writing works, like what it is and how it works and what that means for them. And like I've gone so crazy with this lately, Margie, that I think I can prove to you why you should spend more time on your writing by reference to computational science principles.
Oh,
So it's not actually that big of a thing. And for listeners who listened to the last episode with Professor Chambliss, they'll recognize this. But so this is Wikipedia level knowledge. But there's Bremerman's limit, which is it's like the maximum rate of computation that can be performed by a computational system in a given volume. So if you had like a computer the size of the Earth and you had maximized the efficiency within that volume, it would be able to do this at this speed, this at this speed, this at this speed. And the point that I would draw out of that is that thinking takes time. which is kind of a truism, but it's not one that really hits home for a lot of students as they try to
Mhm.
do their essay on the last day and think that they're just supposed to understand instantly the logical structure of everything they're doing. It's like, no, no, it's we say that it's a process because that's true,
Mhm.
not because we're just trying to put fancy words on it. It's, you do actually have to spend time because you live. I mean, the reason you have to spend time is because you live in a material universe, and I don't spend a lot of time talking about that because, like I said, this is an example of how I go crazy and not what I should be talking to my students about. But
So,
yeah,
along with thinking takes time, is like writing isn't hard. Thinking is hard, and that's I think a confusion. When I'm sitting and struggling with writing, it's not that I'm having trouble creating a sentence and putting in a comma. It's that I'm having trouble figuring out what I'm thinking. I mean, I can sit down and write an email, and most people can sit down and write a long email to their friends about stuff and be perfectly clear and coherent and eloquent. So it's the like I'm thinking through these ideas, and I do it in engaging with a piece of paper, um, and that's the hard part.
that's yeah. I mean, what I tell my students is never worry about what to say and how to say it at the same time because that's just each of those tasks is far more complicated than people think about.
Mhm.
On the one hand, if we're talking about what to say, it's like these aren't simple ideas. They're very, very complicated ideas. And you probably think that they're a bit simple, but they're not. Like, I want a sandwich. That's a simple idea.
Mhm.
Anything that you're going to write about in college is not simple. So you're going to have to spend most of your concentration on wrapping your head around the shape of those ideas.
Mhm.
And on the other hand, you've got how to say it. And what I point out is, well, how many people do you know who, when they open their mouths, know every word that's going to come out? And like, if I ask that to the class, like one person may raise their hand sometimes and they'll know one person. Like, and if you say that you know more than two people, you're lying. I don't believe you,
Right.
or I think you're mistaken.
Right.
But
Professor Kelly and no one else.
yes, yes, it's always, one person and it's Professor Kelly and he's the only guy who's figured that out. Um, but yeah, and it's just, do you have any good way of, so that when we can sit here and we can tell students that, right? But I think, as I hinted at earlier, it's very easy for a student to hear that and go, "Oh, that makes sense," and then they go off and they've learned something in some sense, like on a surface level, and then they sit down and all their old habits kick back in,
Right.
and because it's a thing that you have to believe at a deeper operational level than just the surface intellectual level. And
Right.
I don't know, do you have?
Yeah.
I'm still working on in my own teaching how to get students to practice, I guess, what I'm preaching to them, such that they actually come to believe it on an operative level. And I don't know
Right.
how you
Yeah,
do that.
it's the Puritans said, or the notional and experimental, right? Your head gets it, but your heart doesn't. Um, so the things that I try, I mean, the whole idea of drafting, of process, of I actually try with some students, dear Margie letters. Just send me an email, and that works a lot with students working on senior theses, which are they're so huge. It's how do I start? Just like don't worry about it. Send me an email, and in the email, tell me all the things you're thinking about, and don't worry about order. Don't worry about like being able to complete a thought or you can just like that's how much I have to think about that right now, and then go on to the next thing. Ways of breaking out of feeling that my first sentence is my first sentence,
Mm,
and that will be in the finished product, and the second sentence will be in the finished product. Um, I love computers because I can start in the middle when I'm working on something. I said, this is, I know I'm going to want to talk about this and I know what I want to say about it. So I'm going to write that. And I don't have to worry about where it goes in the larger piece. or I can write myself to a kind of dead end, and then open a different file and write about something else, and then come back. Or you can read through what you've written, and then, particularly I get to these dead ends. I know I have more to say, but I can't figure out how to get there from where I am. And inevitably, what happens when I go back and read through is I'll discover that, well, oh, I just got myself back to a point that I'd already made, and I need to sort of untangle things. But because it's all electronic, it's so easy to do that, and it always
Yes.
looks beautiful. I mean, you young people have no idea what it was like when you were composing on a yellow legal pad with a pencil, and how messy everything got. The flip side, the problem is, of course, that when you type on a computer, everything looks lovely, and so when you just sort of print off whatever you thought, it looks lovely. It looks lovely on the surface.
Right. If you glance at it, like
Yeah,
actually,
right,
literally, physically glance at it,
right.
you know.
As an object, it's pretty.
Mhm. And then
Yeah,
you look closer, and it's like lorem ipsum that you've just copied and pasted in. And
right. Yeah, so I think so. I mean, the other thing that's really hard about writing is that it's always hard, and it gets better, but it never gets not hard. And part of that happens because every time you accomplish one kind of thing, someone asks you to do a different kind of thing.
right.
And I remember my freshman year in college, we wrote these little tiny paragraphs, and it was really hard for me to not write a paragraph that was a page and a half. And to get it down to these really tight paragraphs, and then we worked up in that first semester. I think my last paper was 3 pages, and then the next semester they wanted 5 pages. How could I possibly write 5 pages about this
Yeah.
tale from Chaucer? I've said everything that there is to say. You know, um,
Wow.
and then when you get the 5 page paper down, then there's, oh, now let's do 10, or let's do 25, or let you move into a different discipline, which has different um, rules and expectations. So yeah, so it's not something that you can. I mean, there used to be the idea that everybody took freshman comp, and then we were done, and you didn't have to think about
Hmm.
writing anymore. And it's just not true. People are. I mean, here I am. I'm almost 65, and I'm still like struggling as I think about my writing.
Well, the thing I think about that is that what the skill that you want students to learn as a teacher, at least this the thing that I want my students to learn is not exactly how to write. Like that's just part of that, obviously. I prefer them to come out at least marginally better writers at the end of the semester than
Yeah.
they were at the beginning. That would be good. But it's not what I really want them to learn is how to learn to write the essay that's in front of you.
Hmm.
It's like because as you pointed out, it's like the reason that writing doesn't get easier in some sense is because it's a different thing every time. Like if you sat down and you wrote the same essay 100 times, you get better at writing that essay. In
Right.
the same way that if you went out and threw a football 100 times, you get better at throwing the football. But if every time you threw the football, I handed you a different shaped object that you had to now hurl down the field,
Right.
there would be some carryover because you're still trying to propel the thing and you're probably going to wind up like this. But you actually have to look at the thing and figure out, okay, well, how am I going to get this one down the field?
Mhm.
You have to, so the skill that's developed there is actually how to assess the problem and adapt to it, as
Right.
opposed to rinse and repeat the same process and the same motions.
Right.
Um,
Well,
and
and
there's
that
also,
yeah,
yeah.
and that's the I'm sure you've encountered it. That's also so I frequently the first couple of papers, um, I will ask a question about the text, and I will get a book report.
Right.
Lovely book report, thorough, all sorts of information about what happened in the story, which I know because I've read it a lot. And I asked you a question, answer my question. Even in the writing course when I used to teach, it was, if you were to begin your autobiography, where would you begin and why? If you were to write it, where? And I say I want a paragraph. And after a while, I started actually talking in class about my question and why I was doing this and what I wanted. I want to find out. how you would answer that question. I want to know where you would start. What would it look like? It would be a paragraph. I would begin my autobiography with this moment. And then still I would get, I was born on October 4th, 1956. And it's like, I didn't ask for the autobiography. I asked this other question.
Yeah, it's like when you ask someone, "Hey, what's the time?" and they go, "Well, time's an interesting concept. You know, the first watches were invented," and you're like, "Okay, great, but what's the time?" And I think this I'm glad you mentioned that because I think it brings us back to the whole communicative versus performative writing
Hmm.
idea. Because I spend a lot of time trying to write very clear assignments for my students,
Hmm.
and I try to, and I obsess over that thing. I try to make it the most direct thing that I can to say, your job here, like, do this thing, answer this question. It's up at the front, you can't miss it.
Hmm.
And I will still have students who read that, but they don't hear it. They treat it as if it's like Foucault, it's some object or performance to be interpreted, as opposed to, no, I am literally speaking to you through the paper. I just wrote it down so I wouldn't have to tell you about it every time you asked.
Hmm.
And that's actually me behind the assignment. So answer my question like we're actually two people communicating. And I don't know how to, I don't know, other than just saying that, how to get students to
Well,
think like that.
so the other thing I'm thinking about the Milton class, and I used to start out with an explication, which I still do, although I don't call it an explication because people don't know what that is. But here's the passage, here's the question, write about the passage, and I'm very upfront about that, saying, no, I want to see how you're managing his sentences, which are very hard and confusing, and I want you to slow down so that you understand that you can't read this poem by just sliding across the surface. You've got to read it more slowly. And then I can also find out a little bit about people's assumptions about what you do when you're writing, and find out if someone is really in trouble and you're being early. But and I still do that as the first thing, just because it's the only way to get everybody. And like this spring, I'll have 21. I can't have 21 individual meetings right away. But then I have individual meetings, those read alouds, where read a passage, explain the passage to me, tell me all the things that you noticed about it. And it's a way for me to push on close reading, because I can say, well, what about this word? Have you thought about that? Or, I can model how I would work with the text. But it also is an occasion to, we're talking about the passage, not so much, the performance is all in the reading aloud. But once we get into the conversation, it's a conversation. And then take that's what you're supposed to be doing on paper, what we just did in the group. And
Mm.
I'm planning this spring to actually have more reading alouds, and maybe some small group reading alouds. Just again, to just the point is to be talking with each other about this text and explaining to somebody else your understanding of what's going on.
Well, that's, I mean, in that, I still think that the oral exam, that the group oral exam that you had us do was the only, and this shocks me to this day. I legitimately and stresslessly enjoyed that.
Yay!
Like I didn't, and part of it, I guess, was because I was in my fourth year and I had worked with you to some extent before, so I knew you. I knew that's how you were presenting it, and there wasn't any sort of, that wasn't just superficial guise over top of the evaluative stuff. That was actually kind of what you wanted.
Hmm.
And but I mean, I've sat down in oral exams before where I was terrified. That's probably most of them. And
Hmm.
I've sat down in oral exams where I was genuinely interested and had fun, but there was still like this background,
Hmm.
I'm being evaluated, so I'm appropriately on edge, I guess.
Hmm.
That was the only oral exam where I just went in. I had things I wanted to say and think about, but we just talked,
Yeah.
and that was it.
Well, and that reminds me. A couple of years ago, they were doing a study about discussion and trying to figure out how to evaluate. When we say people should learn how to discuss better, how would you evaluate a better, say that's a better discussion than that's discussion? And so they asked if they could videotape conversations in my first year my intro lit class, and then in Milton. And I said, sure. And so they did some stuff in the intro lit class. And then there was a small group oral exam that they were videotaping in Milton. And I watched these young women listen to each other and respond to one another, and and go back to something that someone had said. I was like, oh yes, this is what we're going for. It's sort of like pushing towards this. I'm really in a conversation, and we try to do this when we bring in scholarly work, and as you get more advanced, you're joining a conversation that's ongoing, that's been going on for decades, and your job as a writer and as a scholar is to figure out how you fit in that conversation and then extend it. And that's the challenge of graduate school, is how to figure out.
That's the Burkean cocktail party effect.
Yeah. So yeah.
That's interesting. That's just, again, I'm trying to tease out which particular tangent I want to go down.
Okay.
But I don't know. It's so maybe this is a bit of a tangent, but this is an idea that I've been batting around, and I want to see what you think about it.
Okay.
It has to do with assigning, assignments, and the hypothesis, I suppose, is this: there are basically 3 ways in which you can present an assignment or task to your student. You can tell them to make a thing, like write a comparative analysis paper. You can tell them to do the action that making that thing entails. So compare this with this, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a direct imperative command.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can ask them the question that is embedded within that task. What is something in this text that you didn't know before you read the other text, or something mm-hmm. like that? Mm-hmm. And my thought is that the make a thing way of presenting a task is terrible. I hate it. That's an oversimplification, but I don't like it. The do an action is better and maybe necessary, because it clearly conveys the thing that you have to actually start doing. So it gives them marching orders in some sense. Mm-hmm. And then the question is in some ways the best, insofar as it doesn't just tell you here's what to do, but in answering the question, they've already taken the first step in doing it. So I've told you, like,
yeah. So
and I don't know what you think about that.
It says why you're doing it. Why am I putting these two things together? Because if I do that, I will learn something more about this one text. So I've given you Keith Hortshoy's work, right?
Yes, and I've used it.
Yeah.
I brought that book home with me somewhere.
Yeah. So he's the one who says that most clearly, that when you put two things together, right, you got to have one, right, and one is subordinate to the other. One is what you're focusing on. The other is what will help you open up the primary text. Yeah. Yeah. So the more self-disclosing the assignment is, the more likely it will be successful. And my teaching has been very influenced by being a parent. Both of my boys are really difficult students. Right? They're both getting PhDs right now, one in epidemiology and one in computer science. But they do not suffer. They do not suffer fools. and they do not like make work. And I'm sure it's my fault that they're like this, but I became hyper conscious as I was, say, we're going through middle school, high school, and I was designing assignments about like being very upfront about here's what I'm asking you to do, here's why I'm asking you to do it, here's what I think the benefit will be of this activity. And if it's not working, tell me. Because I was so tired of the sort of tantrums at home and frustration about this stupid teacher. And I'd look at the assignment and yeah, it was a kind of stupid assignment. Although I sort of understood what the goal was, but it didn't seem to me that the person making the assignment had thought through how am I going to get to that goal through this assignment. And so the more you as a teacher can be upfront about what you want people to get out of this thing, the more likely it is to be successful for them.
I think it also ties into if you want them to communicate to you in their writing, then you kind of need to communicate to them in your writing. And I mean, I think you cite this from something else, but I know it through you that the advice you, or when you are grading or reviewing or giving feedback on a student's work, describe, don't evaluate.
Right. So that's from Haim Ganat, who is a child psychologist, mid 20th century child psychologist. Right. And yeah, and the other trick is that if I'm thinking about making an assignment in order to assess and rank, that's one thing. If I'm making an assignment to help people learn, which is what I want to be doing, then I do a different kind of assignment, and I want to be. When I used to give if you were to write your autobiography, where would you begin and why? I would just give out that question, and that was a kind of assessment and ranking. I wanted to see who knew to answer the question, who would write a paragraph when I asked for a paragraph and not a book.
Mm-hmm.
Those sorts of and then I realized, well, this is dumb and counterproductive. I want them to understand what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And so then you get much more open about what the point of the assignment is and what the outcome means to be. And it's much easier to write about yourself than it is to write about a text. So that's why we start there. Then I can see the things that I want to see as well, like what's the level of vocabulary? How does the person handling a sentence? Who might have second language interference issues that I would want to then be able to address, and not turning it into some kind of a hoop to jump through.
Mm-hmm. So here's a really random question. On the second language people who are coming in, especially from like speaking Chinese because it's such a structurally different language, but really from anywhere. I am of the opinion that a lot of at least a significant portion of the writing problems that those students have are not actually language barrier problems. They're actually the same problems as everyone else has that we've been talking about here. But because everyone's predisposed to see it as, well, it's a language barrier issue, they kind of lump it in with that. I don't know what your experience is on that.
So I would say two things. So it's conceptual, and a lot of that depends on what tradition you come out of, and what does an argument look like in your academic experience. So if we're talking about students who came up through the American school system, then this is not relevant. But if you've got a student coming in from China, there's a different idea about how you write, about how you present yourself, how you organize ideas. I know that the French department was having a huge issue with students going to France for junior year, where you do the thèse, antithèse, and synthesis. Anyway, this very structured kind of argument in the formal classes, and then coming back and having to write a senior thesis in American academic style, which is so they were totally unprepared, and so they had to rethink how they did their senior thesis course to get kids into that mold. But what I have discovered for the second language issue is that actually it's not the writing, but it's vocabulary. So when I ask students to write about things that they know about, like orthogonal projections or mitosis or their autobiography, they write beautifully. But if I give them a text that has a lot of complicated vocabulary, they spend so much time looking things up. When I started asking in the summer program people what words did you have to look up? And the first piece that I did, it was only 2 pages long, and there were words that I expected everybody to need to look up, like genuflect and icon and things like that. And it was like we had almost all of the words up on the board, and that slows you down. And then how can you communicate your understanding when you're still working at the understanding?
Yeah, that's even at the graduate level. That's something that's gotten to me, which is we were reading. Well, I could cite any number of things from this semester, but we did Heidegger at one point, and he's got all his little, almost they're like kenning isn't quite the right word, but they're ready to hand and present to hand, and he means something very specific by each of those. And it's like it was surprising to me, even at that level, how much more I understood the thing if I just looked up the word.
Mm-hmm.
And then went back and read it again. Oh, this makes sense now. Like I had to watch, we were reading Derrida at some point, and I've not done a lot of that before, and I had to look up like a 5-minute YouTube video on difference, just so I could understand what it had, like these little cartoon guys talking about what it was. I'm like, all right, now I understand. I can go back and do the reading now.
Right.
But,
Well,
yeah.
and one of the best things that I have been able to do at Hamilton is when I'm on leave to sit in on a class.
Mm.
So I've taken a number of classes in the music department and one in botany. And it's really humbling to be a student again and trying to negotiate. There was a textbook in the music history class, and I read the first chapter and went to the professor and said, I'm not going to be able to take this class. I did not understand this chapter. They keep using words like the word tone. I thought I knew what tone meant, but somehow it's not working right here. And she said, I told you it would be hard. It's like, yeah, but I'm a grown up. I've got a PhD. I should be able to read the first chapter in a textbook.
Yeah.
But I couldn't. I needed her help. And I got through it.
Right. Well, it goes back to the same thing we were saying at the beginning, which is that it's not, or at least at some point along the way, which is, you think you acquire these skills and that they're just static across all contexts.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But the skills are really about adapting to contexts.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to learn to read the thing in front of you, just like you have to learn to write the paper that's in front of you. Like I'm taking a cognitive science course this next semester because you do that, and I'm very interested in it, at least in the way that a English student who's going into his third English department and has looked over and seen some interesting things in the cognitive science, at least that's kind of the level of my interest in it. So I'm probably going to go in and be rocked off my feet in some sense. So what I'm thinking about doing over the break is at least looking up some very basic terms.
Right.
But, I'm going into it as humbly as I can so that I can, so that I can be rocked off my feet and not be surprised by that. In the same way that when you write an essay, I have my students ask me all the time, like, how do I know if my first thesis is good or correct? And my response nowadays is, it won't be. It won't be. Because what do you know? You just started learning about this topic, right? You've got the whole point in, if it were a topic that you knew everything about, you wouldn't be writing an essay about it because, well, the point of writing an essay isn't to report on ideas, it's to learn something about it. And then you touch it up at the end to report about them. But, it's that attention to context. Mindfulness might be the word for it, although I don't like that word exactly, just in how it's used in some of the literature. But yeah, you got to roll with the punches.
Right. So when I start writing, I know the kinds of things that I want to look at,
Hmm.
and I have a pretty good idea of some of the things that I'm going to want to say, but I always learn more about whatever I'm writing about in the process of writing about it, and often I have to go back and adjust what I thought my point was, or even totally change what I thought was the interesting point. Right, there's a point that I had that it turns out is not anywhere near as exciting as some other point.
Right.
The only person that I've ever spoken to who says I never revise anything is Alfred Kelly.
I was about it's Al Kelly. Actually,
I hope you're interviewing him. Your students need to.
I should get him on. I um for for con oh uh sorry, family interruptions. But yeah, no, Al Kelly is what's the best? I'm just saying this for the listeners. You know that picture of a professor who's like very gruff and seems to know everything and is just demanding beyond but like beyond belief, but he actually cares and like deep under the sort of crust almost. And all those professors that you had, yeah, they were only images of the platonic ideal that is Alfred Kelly. But
I always wanted to buy him the shirt that says, if I'm speaking, you should be writing things down."
that's a good one. I only ever had one class with him, and it was co-taught with by Professor Chambliss, who
Mhm.
is in some ways on the other end of things, kind of. So I think it balanced it out.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
great.
but
Mhm.
yeah, I don't know. Is there anything that we've talked about so far that you would want to touch on as we're wrapping this up and trying to bring some kind of order to this vast array of tangents that we've laid out in the last hour?
So maybe students would find it reassuring just to recognize that it's a struggle and we're all in it together, and that everybody is trying everybody is trying to be more clear and more persuasive, and um, Paul Graham, that essay that I my son recommended from the internet, who turns out to be some really super. I think he invented Linux. Some super important
What?
computer guy.
I still use that essay. I like
Like,
okay, fair enough.
some guy. Um, but oh, now what I've forgotten what I was gonna say about him. Ah,
Something about all struggling together.
we want to be clear. We want to communicate. We want to learn things, and that if you should be learning as you're writing, and you should be comfortable with that.
Yeah,
So that it's not just some formulaic thing I'm going through, um, but part of really building knowledge. Now I can bring it back to Milton, right? So we're putting the truth together piece by piece, and we will never find it because it's not a static thing.
Aeroprojectica,
It's
right?
it's the struggle. Yes, very good.
Well, I should clarify. I only know that because I was reading it actually a few weeks ago because
Oh,
I
even
was
better.
considering replacing my Foucault reading next semester with an excerpt of Aeroprojectica. I'm still kind of considering it, but I'm definitely not going to include the first part, which is just as difficult as Foucault, and even actually less substantial at the heart of the piece. But
Mhm.
I mean, I just
Right.
think that his well, it's off your topic, but I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue. I mean, I
Mhm.
that section is just beautiful.
Yeah.
But he's the point he makes, if I'm recalling correctly, is that at in the downfall of man in Judeo-Christian theology, essentially the shards of truth were scattered around the world,
Mhm.
and that it has been the project of man over the centuries and millennia to collect, to find them, gather them, and put them back into some kind of semblance of what might be called truth with a capital T. And he
Mhm.
said the line is something like, these shards have been scattered everywhere. We have not found them all.
Right.
And then like, nor shall we until like,
Oh, the
Christ
second
comes again and
coming, right.
everything.
Yeah.
So, but
But I
I
think
think it's very good to
yeah.
know that, like you said, it's even your professors are struggling with you
Mhm.
in some sense. I'm perfectly willing to learn from my students. Like, I'm
Yeah,
not just going to sit back and be lazy about it. Like, I do think I know some things that it would be useful for them to know. But I mean, I always tell my students, I want you to tell me I don't ever want you to write me an essay that tells me what you think I want to hear, because what I want to hear is what you actually think.
right,
Because
right. And we could add in, so all of your professors are really interested in learning new things and finding out what's true about the field that they're interested in. And they do this because they're interested in it. And it is a lot of hard work and it's hugely time consuming. And my mother-in-law, whenever I wrote an article, would say, well, what are they paying you for it? And I would say, well, I don't get paid. And she'd say, well, why are you doing it? So we're all slightly insane.
oh
Um,
yeah, absolutely.
but the struggle, we all believe that the struggle is worth it. It would be possible just to go get another job where I don't have to like think very much, or I could think the same thing every day, and I wouldn't like that.
So maybe here's a final question. This is
Yeah.
just definitely not one that I projected at the beginning, but
Mhm.
which I want to ask you, I think, of all people. You say that you think the struggle is worth it. When it comes to writing, for example, articles about literature, what is the point of studying literature? Like, I have my own thoughts on that, and because what's the purpose there?
Well, I work mainly on poetry, and most poets seem to me to be trying to say something true about the human experience, about their own experience of the human experience, um, that is absolutely personal to them, but also universal. And they want to say it as precisely as possible. And so for me, being able to advocate for what they're actually saying seems to be, I guess, what I do. Um, to sort of because I will encounter other people who have read writers and I think have read them superficially or much too quickly or have misunderstood things or have read their own concerns onto them and I feel like I'm standing up for the people of the past.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
it's very funny. I've known that I agree with you on many things, and that's probably not coincidental, given that I've studied under you, um, in both an academic and a professional context. But I think I've realized over the course of this conversation that I agree with you on so much more than I thought, which
Great.
is good and bad, I
Very
suppose.
gratifying. No.
But I taught when I'm teaching my students summarizing. The thing I teach them is, you know, write a summary such that if you handed it to the person, they'd sign off on it and say, yeah, that's a fair representation of my ideas. And that applies both to the people, that applies to your classmates, because what I'll do in discussions
Mhm.
is have students, before they're allowed to reply to a comment, be it to agree with it or disagree with it or qualify it, they actually have to they have to summarize the thing that the student before them said and get that student's approval on it before they're allowed to make their own extension on it. So it operates with the people you're directly talking to, but I've also assigned pieces from Meng Zhu from ancient China. And I've said, same thing. It's not different. He's dead. I don't care that he's dead. He wrote the thing down, so it wouldn't matter that he's dead. He's still talking to you, even half the world away in like 2,500 years, and also he's dead. This is still an act of communication from the past. The quote, that's actually, I guess, George Thomas Tansel I'm quoting there. But, there's people that are talking to you, and maybe they have something that you need to know. And maybe if you took the time to understand it, it'd be helpful.
Well, that's one thing that Milton says about the value of reading, and he's talking, of course, about being able to read Latin and Greek, is that you can communicate with minds across centuries and continents and be in conversation, even if you're just sitting in your own room.
Yeah. And like, it's not a trivial. This is. I'm going to rein myself in just a little bit because I'm just about to start I don't know what that was, but I heard the Alexa unit downstairs talking about South Korea. So I have no idea what's going on there. But anyway, yeah, I'm about to start a whole new conversation about the value of listening to literature and how that's actually a very practical, grounded thing as opposed to sort of head in the clouds thing that a lot of, I know, I guess if you're coming from the science end of things, you tend to think it's like you got your head in the clouds and you're just thinking about things as opposed to being grounded in reality. But no, that's not quite right. Like, you can do that. That's very true. But that's not all that's going on. But yeah, I think it's because this conversation is clearly going on and on and on in all different directions. And so here would be my, I guess, final question. And it's the same question I asked at the beginning. But you got your students in front of you. You got as many students who are going to watch this as you have. What would you say to them? What's like, what do they need to hear?
Well, I think I already said it, that it's a struggle and it's a worthwhile struggle and other people are in it with you. And as long as you take what you're doing seriously and as in, I am really trying to figure something out and communicate to somebody else, you will be successful. If you think about it as trying to fill a certain number of pages or impress someone, you're going to fall on your face. It's going to be really frustrating. That's what I would say.
I think that is a perfect place to stop. So,
great. Well, it's been lovely to talk with you.
Professor Margaret Thickstun of Hamilton College, everyone. And
thank you so much.
You've just finished an episode of Things That First-Year Writers Need to Hear. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing. It'd help this reach more people. And check out another episode if you want, or maybe something a bit shorter if you'd prefer.